At first glance, it was just an ordinary house in the American city of Syracuse, New York. A modest one-story cottage with a neat yard, a well-kept lawn, and an old concrete garage. Next door lived families with children, elderly couples, and students. None of them had any idea that right beneath this house was hidden one of the most terrifying secrets in the history of American criminology. For nearly 3 decades, the name John Thomas Jamelski aroused no suspicion at all. Born in the early 1930s, he was polite, reserved, a bit withdrawn, but not considered dangerous by those around him. He often walked, visited the library, and sometimes drove his old car. But behind this mask of ordinariness was a man who had built a real prison bunker beneath his house. There he kept women for years, women he had kidnapped from the streets and shopping centers. No one heard any screams, no one saw women entering or leaving the house. Jamelski was careful. He built his system of abductions, manipulation, and control step by step, starting back in the 1970s. In a dungeon he built with his own hands, he locked up his victims, isolating them from the world, from light, and from hope. For a long time, no one knew about this except the captives themselves. The police, neighbors, even his own family. Everyone was in the dark. The secret was only revealed in the early 2000s, when one of the victims managed to pass a note pleading for help. That note marked the beginning of the end for a years-long nightmare hidden beneath a concrete slab. But before the truth came to light, there was one element that truly stunned the investigators. And that was the door to nowhere. When the police first entered Jamelski's house, everything looked suspiciously ordinary. Old interior, minimalism, no signs of a woman's presence. But one element made the investigators uneasy. In the corner of the concrete garage, there was a small, barely noticeable hatch cover. It was tightly shut. On top of it were boxes, tools, and old furniture. All of it looked like ordinary junk until one of the officers noticed a metal loop covered in dust. After a brief preparation, they opened the hatch. Beneath it was a narrow, vertical shaft leading down into darkness. A metal ladder descended to a depth of about 1 story. Descending, the investigators found themselves in a corridor less than 3 feet wide, with concrete walls, exposed wiring sticking out, and an oppressive dampness. The air was stale, the smell rancid, a mix of mold, plastic, and something else. The corridor led to a metal door, secured from the inside with several locks. Opening it, the officers entered the main room, a narrow, windowless concrete chamber with a single source of light, a lamp hanging from the ceiling. Inside the room stood an iron bed with a filthy mattress, a plastic bucket serving as a toilet, and a pile of scattered items, bottles, clothes, and boxes filled with women's belongings. This was not just a bunker, it was a prison, meticulously planned and built for the long-term confinement of living people. The walls were soundproofed, the ventilation was hidden, and the door was reinforced so that the victim could neither escape nor be heard. The investigators stood in complete silence. Then one of them noticed a word scratched into the wall with a fingernail. "Help!" But the real horrors began when they started to examine the room further, because everything inside indicated that people had been kept there for the long term, not for a day, not for a week, but for months, and possibly even years. What exactly they found inside was only the beginning. The smell in the concrete walls. As soon as the investigators began to examine the bunker in more detail, they immediately realized this place had harbored decades of darkness. The air was filled not only with mustiness, but with something else. A mixture of old blood, sweat, fear, and chemicals. The forensic specialists who came down later confirmed the walls were saturated with organic matter not only because of the living conditions of the captives but also due to traces of violence. In the corner of the bunker, there was a curtained-off section. Behind the plastic curtain was a makeshift shower area. The floor was slippery, the walls were stained, and personal belongings were scattered everywhere. Women's shoes, children's socks, a broken bracelet, a hairbrush. All of this indicated that women of different ages, races, and backgrounds had been here. On one of the boxes stood jars of medicine, sedatives, painkillers, antibiotics. Nearby were a coil of rope, duct tape, and a box of audio cassettes. Some of the cassettes were labeled. The first one, long, bad. Investigators also discovered a primitive alarm system connected to the hatch door. Jamelski would know in advance if someone tried to get inside. He had time to go down and lock the entrance from within. Everything was thought out. On the floor, they found footprints, bare, female feet. They led from the bed to the wall where someone had scratched out a calendar. The scratches marked days, weeks, months, until they abruptly stopped. The question why still remained unanswered. But at that time, the investigator still didn't know that this place had become a house of terror for the women he had snatched from their lives and kept here for months. And one of them was still very close by. Prisoners from the darkness. Jamelski abducted women of different ages and races, from teenagers to adults. According to the investigation, his first recorded victim was abducted in the late 80s. She was a girl from an Asian family who disappeared on her way to the store. Her relatives searched for her for years, but the case went cold. The next was an African-American teenager who vanished in the 90s. Then, a woman from Latin America. In total, at least 5 victims are known, whom he held at different times. He kept them one after another. When he released one, he would take a new one. Some spent more than 9 months in the bunker. According to the victims, the food was meager, often spoiled, and the sanitary conditions were terrible. There was no contact with the outside world. He rarely spoke and mostly just gave orders. But there were also strange elements. He gave his captives notebooks, allowed them to keep diaries, and left them audio recorders. One of the victims described how he tried to create a homely atmosphere while completely controlling their every move. Despite the fear and pain, it was these women who became the key to exposing Jamelski. One of them, a 25-year-old Latina woman, managed to persuade him to give her a sheet of paper. She wrote a note and secretly passed it through a pharmacy where he sometimes accompanied her. The pharmacist handed it over to the police. This letter led the police to the house that hid horror beneath its lawn. But how did he choose his victims? Why them specifically? The answer to this question turned out to be even more disturbing. The hunting method. Jamelski was not a chaotic criminal. He planned each abduction in advance. He chose those who seemed vulnerable, girls without companions, showing signs of poverty, those who were unlikely to be searched for quickly. His targets were often minors or foreign women. He used various methods, from fake job ads to luring victims into his car under the pretense of offering help. He carefully stalked his victim, observed her routine and routes, and sometimes could follow her for weeks before making a move. His method was a quick, lightning-fast abduction, after which he would vanish from the streets. Inside the bunker, his behavior changed. He controlled their food, clothing, and sleep, sometimes punishing them, sometimes playing the role of a caring host. All of this was part of his strategy to break their will. But the most chilling part was his complete confidence in his own impunity. He didn't believe he was doing anything criminal. In his diary, he wrote that he was creating a safe place for women so that they would be under control and not in danger on the streets. And all this time, while he was hunting women and keeping them in the basement, he was making audio recordings. The thin tapes, neatly labeled, became crucial pieces of evidence. But what exactly was on those tapes? The answer turned out to be terrifying. A voice from the basement. During the search of the bunker, investigators found plastic boxes containing dozens of audio tapes. Most were labeled by hand. Number 1, silence, rules, long recording, and other equally strange titles. When the tapes were played, it became clear they were personal recordings made by Jamelski himself. Some of them were monologues, others were dialogues with the victims, and still others were peculiar lessons in behavior that he forced the women to listen to. On one of the tapes, Jamelski's voice, with icy calm, explains his rules: what is allowed, what is forbidden, when to speak, when to remain silent. His tone was polite, almost gentle, which only made it more frightening. He described the daily routine, introduced punishments and rewards. In another recording, you can hear him instructing a new captive, congratulating her that she is now safe and must obey, otherwise things will go badly as they did last time. There were also inscriptions found on the walls of the bunker. Some were scratched with fingernails, others with metal objects. Among them were calendar tallies, names, pleas for help, and incomprehensible symbols. Some marks were repeated like a mantra, possibly as a way to keep from going insane. The most disturbing was a tape titled The Long One. On it, for almost 2 hours, you can hear one of the women talking about her life, crying, and begging to be released. Jamelski listened in silence, then played his instructions again. These audio recordings became not only evidence, but also a nightmare for the investigators, because each one is a living testimony of fear, hopelessness, and horror. Their contents helped to understand exactly how this prison operated. But even more, they revealed the regime to which the women were subjected every day, without respite. Hours of violence. Every morning in the bunker began not with the sunrise, but with the sound of the lamp being switched on. The women were forbidden to sleep when the light was on. Jamelski would come in, bringing food, canned goods, water, sometimes bread or grains. He demanded silence, obedience, sometimes asked questions, and wrote down the answers. The victims said that the days blended into a single stream. Without clocks, windows, or any points of reference, time lost all meaning. He would come according to his own schedule, sometimes every day, sometimes with breaks. This only intensified the fear. The violence was not only physical, but also psychological. He manipulated them, made them sing, dance, tell stories, and sometimes threatened to replace the captive if she was disobedient. All of this was accompanied by recordings on cassettes, which he would later listen to again. He forced one of the women to keep an obedience diary. Every day she wrote about how she behaved, what she did right, and what she was punished for. These notebooks were found and also became evidence. A letter addressed to a future captive was especially frightening. In it, the victim begged the one who would be there after her not to lose hope and to remember that she was not alone. The bunker was not just a place of confinement, it was a system for suppressing one's personality, a gradual transformation of a living person into a shadow. However, what Jamelski did not take into account was the strength of the survivors. Their testimonies became not just evidence, but a weapon against him. And when they began to speak, the whole world learned just how devastating the consequences of this underground captivity were. Broken lives. When the police freed the last victim, she was unable to speak at first. The first week passed in complete silence. Psychologists recorded post-traumatic shock, disorientation, and fear of any noise. Only after 2 weeks did the woman begin to share her memories. According to her, she spent almost 10 months in the underground dungeon. During that time, she did not see a single ray of sunlight, nor did she hear any voices except his. She forgot what fresh air smelled like. At first, she hoped that someone was looking for her, then that she would be found dead and it would all be over. Other victims discovered earlier gave similar testimonies. One developed a fear of the dark, another couldn't enter enclosed spaces. Almost all of them experienced problems with trust, communication, and living a normal life. Many underwent therapy for years, couldn't get a job, start relationships, or even go outside without someone accompanying them. But despite all this, several women agreed to testify in court. One of them spoke in person, looking directly at Jamelski as he sat in the courtroom. She said, "You tried to destroy me, but I'm here. You didn't win." These women not only survived a terrible trauma, they became key figures in exposing a man who hid behind the facade of a polite neighbor. But to understand how he justified everything he did, investigators had to look into the most horrifying thing: his personal records, diary secrets. During a search of the house and garage, police discovered several notebooks, folders, and a stack of handwritten pages. These were Jamelski's own diaries. He had kept them for decades. In them, he described watching potential victims, planning abductions, and recorded his thoughts and feelings about what was happening. But what struck most were the entries where he justified his actions. In one of the notebooks, he wrote that the world was too dangerous for women and that he was doing them a favor by taking them to a safe place. He compared himself to a shepherd and the captives to helpless beings who needed to be controlled. He called the bunker a refuge and himself the curator of order. And nowhere in his writings was there a trace of remorse. Everything he did he considered logical, justified, almost noble. That was especially frightening. He didn't think he was a monster. He thought he was order in the midst of chaos. In one of his last entries, he complained about the increased attention to the disappearances, saying that now it was harder to operate and he had to be more careful. Psychologists who analyzed the diaries concluded that Jamelski had a pronounced control mania and a lack of empathy. He was not just a criminal, he was a predator, convinced of his own rightness. And only one event stopped him forever: the day of his arrest. Everything changed in the spring of 2003. It was then that one of the victims, after months of captivity, managed to trick Jamelski and pass a note asking for help. This happened in a pharmacy. He would sometimes take her there, controlling her every move. While he was distracted, she slipped the note into a box of pills and left it on the counter. The pharmacist noticed it, read it, and immediately called the police. 2 days later, the police identified the address. They arrived and started by questioning Jamelski himself. At first, he denied everything and acted calmly, but he got confused in his statements. Then, during a second visit, the police presented a warrant, entered the house, and soon discovered a hatch in the garage. The arrest itself took place without resistance. Jamelski did not try to run, did not argue. He simply remained silent. He didn't even ask any questions. When he was being taken to the station, one of the officers said, "Do you understand that it's over for you?" And Jamelski nodded. After the arrest, an extensive interrogation began, evidence was collected, and preparations for the trial started. Amir learned for the first time the name of the man who, for almost 20 years, kept women in hell, right underground, in the very heart of a residential neighborhood, the Court of Darkness. The trial of John Jamelski began in the fall of 2003 and caused a wide public outcry. For the first time, the media widely reported on this case, revealing details that had not been published before. The prosecution brought 5 main charges against him. All of them concerned the abduction and forcible detention of women. Each charge carried a lengthy prison sentence, up to and including life imprisonment. In court, Jamelski appeared calm, almost emotionless. He pleaded guilty, making no attempt to defend himself. According to the prosecution, this only confirmed his confidence in his own righteousness. He did not feel remorse, he simply accepted the outcome. The court heard the victims' testimonies. Some gave their statements behind closed doors, under protection. One of the women was accompanied by a psychotherapist. She could not be in the same room as Jamelski. Each testimony was harrowing. The women described how he abused them, humiliated them, isolated them from reality, how they lost their sense of time, will, and life. One of them confessed, "I stopped believing I was a person. I became a nameless shadow." Psychologists who testified in court described Jamelski as a highly functional psychopath with obsessive-compulsive traits. His need for control, manipulation, and domination over others was pathological. He felt no guilt, he felt entitled. The verdict was not long in coming. John Thomas Jamelski was found guilty and sentenced to 18 years to life in prison. The judge emphasized, "You did not just kidnap these women's bodies but their lives as well. Their pain will be your shadow for the rest of your life." And although Jamelski will never be free again, the fear remains because the most terrifying thing is not just the crime itself but how long he lived among ordinary people without anyone noticing. He lived among us. When the name John Jamelski was first mentioned on television, the neighbors were in shock. One of them, a retiree, said, "He was quiet, always greeted people. I never would have thought." The owner of the local store recalled how Jamelski would buy canned food, grains, and cheap goods. Everything seemed ordinary. Journalists who came to the street where he lived interviewed the locals. No one had heard any noises, screams, or suspicious sounds. It was all easily explained. The house stood on the corner, away from the others. People didn't look into his yard or take an interest in his life. As a result, for years there was a prison right next to them that no one knew about. Some neighbors admitted that they felt guilty, that maybe they could have noticed something. But the reality was much more frightening. Jamelski skillfully hid behind the mask of an ordinary person, and there may be more people like him. After his arrest, basements, plots of land, and garages in the area began to be checked en masse. The police increased their monitoring of reports about missing persons. The story of Jamelski became a wake-up call, making it clear that evil can be closer than it seems. Journalists gave him the nickname the Cirque Dungeon Master. Psychiatrists called him a controlling narcissist. But most of all, he was remembered as the man who lived among people and hid hell beneath his lawn, an ending in silence. After the trial, Jamelski's house was sealed, later sold at auction, and the bunker was filled with concrete so that no one could enter it. Some activists suggested demolishing the entire building as a symbol of the horror it concealed, but the authorities decided otherwise, simply to close it off and forget. The victims continued to undergo treatment and build new lives. Some still refuse to give interviews and avoid publicity. Their silence is also a form of protection. One of the women later wrote in a book, "The fact that I am alive is already a victory, and everything else I will take with me." The Jamelski case remains in criminology as one of the quietest and most terrifying cases of serial abduction. No blood, no gunfire, no chase, but with a systematic predatory calculation that no one noticed. This is precisely what makes it truly frightening, because real horror is not in the scream, but in the silence that lasted for decades.